What becomes of a woman when everything she loves is stripped away? When left to die, can the claws that reach for you be your salvation? And if crows are your only allies, who, then, shall protect your enemies? They left her in the tower to starve. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a finality that echoed the fall of the executioner's axe. The sound of the iron bolt sliding into place was a cold, hard period at the end of her life sentence. Elara Starkwood did not weep. She had shed all her tears on the muddy ground of the courtyard, watching the love of her life, Lorien, kneel before the false justice of Lord Valerius Blackwood. Now only a hollow, aching cold remained, a void more profound than the darkness of the Raven Keep's highest cell. The first days were a blur of grief and shock. The cold stone floor seeped the warmth from her bones, and the narrow, arrow-slit window offered a cruel, fragmented view of the world she had lost, the mist-shrouded pine forests of the north that were once her home. Her only sustenance was a single wooden bowl of thin, greasy potage and a heel of stale black bread, delivered at irregular intervals by a silent, grim-faced guard. It was not enough to live on. It was just enough to die slowly. Hunger was a gnawing beast in her belly. It started as a dull ache and sharpened into a constant, twisting pain. Thirst coated her throat in dust. Her mind, once sharp and learned, blessed with Lorien's teachings on botany and the old ways of the wood, began to play tricks on her in the shadows. She saw his face in the grain of the wood, heard his voice in the howling wind that whistled through the tower. And then there were the crows. They were the true inhabitants of the Raven Keep, a swirling, cawing cloak of black feathers and intelligent, gleaming eyes. At first they were a nuisance. Their incessant, grating cries scraped at her raw nerves. They perched on the window ledge, tilting their heads, observing her misery with the detached, avian curiosity. She was an intruder in their domain, a piece of broken furniture left to rot. A week into her imprisonment, a shift occurred. The guard had forgotten her bread. The emptiness in her stomach was a yawning chasm. As she sat huddled in a corner, a large crow, larger and darker than the others, landed boldly on the stone floor inside her cell, its eyes like beads of polished jet, fixed on her. A memory surfaced, vivid and painful. Lorien's voice, warm and steady, by the fireside in their solar. They're not just birds, my love. The crows. They see. They remember. My grandfather always said a Starkwood is never alone where the ravens fly. Driven by an impulse she did not understand, Elara broke off a crumb, a precious, minuscule crumb, from the moldy cheese she had saved from yesterday's meal. Her hand trembling, she held it out. The crow hopped closer, cautious. It cocked its head, then, with a swift, precise motion, snatched the morsel from her palm. Its beak was surprisingly gentle. For a moment, it simply stood there, as if assessing her. Then, with a soft cry that was nothing like its usual harsh cry, it launched itself back out the window. The next day it returned. This time it was not alone. The large one, whom she began to think of as more, the old tongue word for darkness, was there, and two others. Again, she shared a pitiful fragment of her food. It felt less like feeding a pest, and more like an offering, a treaty. A strange routine established itself. The crows became her companions in desolation. She began to notice their personalities. Moore was the leader, silent and imposing. A smaller, quicker one was a scout, always the first to investigate. She spoke to them in low whispers, not expecting an answer, but needing to hear a voice, even if it was her own. "Did you see him?" she would murmur to Moore, who watched her from the ledge. "Did you see my Lorien? Do you remember?" The crow would only blink, its dark eyes inscrutable. The turning point came on a day when the hunger was a sharp knife in her gut. She had given them the last of her bread crust, a final, desperate act of a faith she didn't know she possessed. She slumped against the wall, lightheaded, the world swimming in gray spots. This was it, the slow, ignoble end Blackwood had promised. A shadow fell over her. Moore was on the floor before her. In his beak, he held something. It was a dead field mouse. A wave of revulsion washed over her. It was a small, limp thing, its fur matted. But as she stared, the revulsion was met by a stark, primal understanding. This was not a mockery. This was not a random act. This was a gift, a reciprocation. In the brutal economy of survival, this was a king's ransom. With a trembling hand, her stomach clenching in protest, she reached out and took the offering. Moore let go without a struggle, his gaze intense. Tears she thought had dried up forever welled in her eyes. They were not tears of disgust, but of a profound, bewildered gratitude. In this place of betrayal and death, life, in its most raw and unexpected form, had reached out a clawed hand. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of blood and bruise, Elara cooked the mouse over a tiny, desperate flame made from tearing a strip of linen from her dress and using the flint from the wall. It was a meager, grim meal, but it was life. It was hope. She looked at Moore, who now presided over a small parliament of crows on her windowsill. They left her in the tower to starve, she thought, a new, fierce strength kindling in her chest. But the ravens had other plans. The game was afoot, and she was no longer a player. She was the queen. The dead mouse changed everything. It was a key that unlocked a door Elara hadn't known was there, a door leading not to escape, but to alliance. The hollow ache of starvation was, for the moment, held at bay by the grim sustenance, but it was the metaphysical nourishment that truly fortified her. She was not alone. The world was not entirely hostile. Moore, the great obsidian crow, became her constant companion. He was no longer a sporadic visitor, but a sentinel. He would arrive at first light, landing on the stone ledge with a soft thud and a rustle of feathers, his intelligent eyes seeking her out. The initial transactional offering of food had evolved into something more nuanced, a silent dialogue. Elara began her studies. Lorien, her beloved Lorien, had not just been a lord. He had been a scholar of forgotten things. He once told her that every creature has a language, one that exists beyond words. It is a language of patterns, of repetition, of cause and effect. She decided to learn the language of the crows. She started with names. Tearing another strip from the frayed hem of her dress, she fashioned two small, rough dolls. One she placed by a small, gray stone sheet found in a corner. "Lorien," she whispered to Moore, pointing at the doll. She then took a sharp piece of flint she'd pried from the wall and nicked her thumb, smearing a tiny drop of blood on the doll's head. A stark, visceral association. Death. Then, she took the second doll and placed it near a pile of droppings left by a careless guard rat, something she associated with filth and betrayal. "Blackwood." She spat the name, her voice a venomous hiss. She repeated this ritual for days, pointing, naming, associating. Moore watched, his head tilted. She didn't know if he understood the symbols, but she knew he was absorbing the intent, the emotional charge behind her actions. The breakthrough came on the 5th day. She was performing the ritual when Moore suddenly let out a sharp, specific caw, a sound different from his usual repertoire. It was a short, staccato craw-craw. He hopped from the ledge, snatched the Lorien doll in his beak, and dropped it at her feet. Then, he looked directly at her. Elara's breath caught. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a response. "Lorien," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. Moore gave the same, short caw. Craw-craw. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of triumphant connection. She had spoken, and the void had spoken back. She built on this. She developed a system. A slow, deliberate blink meant safe. A rapid series of hops meant danger. She learned that when Moore puffed his feathers and let out a low, guttural rattle, it signified the approach of a guard. Long before she heard the heavy tread on the stairs, her prison, once a place of helpless isolation, was becoming a web of information. The crows became her eyes beyond the stone walls. They brought her tokens, not just of food, but of intelligence. A lost button from a guard's uniform, a shiny piece of broken glass. One day, a smaller crow, the swift scout she called Scout, dropped a fresh sprig of pine at her feet. It was a message from the living world beyond the keep, a scent of freedom that made her heart ache. It was Moore, however, who brought her the first piece of the true puzzle. She had been trying to convey the concept of her mission. Proof, she whispered, holding up a smooth, flat stone she used as a plate. She traced a square in the dust on the floor, then mimed writing on it. Paper. Parchment. She pointed to the Blackwood doll and then made a tearing motion. Find. For Lorien. Moore watched her with an unnerving intensity. He seemed to be processing not just the individual actions, but the narrative they formed. The next evening, as the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, Moore returned. He wasn't alone. He had 3 other crows with him. In his beak, he carried not food, not a trinket, but a crumpled, stained piece of parchment. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She took it with reverent, trembling hands. It was a fragment, torn and filthy, but on it, she could see the distinct, sharp imprint of a wax seal. The seal was broken, but the emblem was unmistakable, the coiled serpent of House Blackwood. This was no love letter. This was document. A official one. The fragment was too small to reveal any meaningful text, but its very existence was a seismic revelation. Lorien's words echoed in her mind. The Raven Keep is not just a prison, Elara. It is an archive. The old lords stored their secrets here, believing the crows would guard them. The crows hadn't just guarded the secrets. They had remembered them, and now they were retrieving them for her. She looked from the serpent seal in her hand to Moore, who stood regally on the windowsill, the dying light glinting in his dark eyes. The first, crucial step was taken. She had asked for proof, and the crows had answered. The hunt for the truth, for the weapon that would clear Lorien's name and destroy Blackwood, was no longer a desperate fantasy. It was a silent, feathery war, and it had just begun. The language of stone and feather was proving to be more eloquent than any courtly decree, and Elara Starkwood was finally learning to speak it. The scrap of parchment became her holy relic. In the perpetual twilight of her cell, Elara would smooth it against the cold stone floor, her fingers tracing the broken edge of the wax seal as if it were a sacred rune. The coiled serpent of House Blackwood seemed to writhe under her touch, a silent confession of its master's venom. It was not proof, not yet. It was a promise, a whisper from the stones of the keep itself, carried on black wings. Her communication with the murder evolved, transforming from simple signals into a complex strategy. The crows were no longer just messengers. They were her intelligence network. She designated specific tasks. The swift and nimble scout and his cohorts were assigned to patrol the perimeter, tracking the movements of the guards. Their language was one of timing. A single caw from the western wall meant the changing of the guard was beginning. A rapid flurry from the east signaled the arrival of a supply cart. Elara began to map the rhythms of her prison, finding comfort in the predictability of her enemy's routines. Moore, however, was reserved for the deeper mystery. He was her chief archivist, her digger in the dust of forgotten secrets. She refined her requests, moving beyond abstract concepts. Using a sliver of charcoal from a half-burnt stick left in her fireplace, she drew on the wall. It was a crude but clear map of her world. A square for the tower, lines for the outer walls, and a series of small X's marking the locations where the crows had their nests, deep within the crumbling mortar and forgotten arrow loops of the ancient structure. Secrets, she whispered to Moore, pointing at the nests on her drawing. More. She then held up the precious parchment fragment. Like this. Hidden. In the walls. In the stones. Moore would cock his head, hopping along the ledge to observe her charcoal map, his glossy eyes flicking from the drawing to her face. The intelligence in his gaze was unnerving. It was the look of a general understanding of battle plan. Days turned into a week of fruitless searching. The crows brought her an assortment of objects. A tarnished copper coin, a pigeon's flight feather, the skeletal wing of a long-dead bat. Each time, hope would flare and then die down, a small, cruel cycle of anticipation and disappointment. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, making her head light and her hands shake, but the hunt kept the despair at bay. She was doing something. She was fighting back. The breakthrough came on a day when a cold, relentless drizzle veiled the world in gray. Moore arrived not with an object in his beak, but with a specific, urgent energy. He landed before her, not giving his usual, composed greeting. Instead, he let out a low, chattering call and pecked insistently at one particular X on her charcoal map, a nest site high up on the northeastern face of the tower, a place shrouded in thick ivy. Then he did something extraordinary. He hopped to the center of the room, where a small puddle of rainwater had seeped through a crack in the ceiling. He dipped his beak into the water and, with a deliberate flick, scattered droplets across the dusty floor. He looked at her, then back at the damp spot, and repeated the motion. Elara stared, her mind racing. Water. Was he trying to tell her something about rain? A leak? No. The meaning clicked into place with the clarity of a struck bell. It wasn't about the water itself. It was about the action. Dipping. Retrieving. Something is hidden in the water, she breathed, incredulous. Near that nest. A leak. A cistern. Moore gave a sharp, affirmative-sounding cry and bobbed his head. It was impossible. It was madness. And yet, hadn't everything since the dead mouse been madness? She had to trust him. This was the path he was showing her. Show me, she commanded, her voice a dry rasp. Bring me something from there, from the wet place. The wait was agonizing. The drizzle turned into a downpour, the sound a drumming roar on the tower's roof. Just as she began to fear Moore would not brave the storm, a dark shape shot through the window, scattering cold rainwater across the floor. It was Scout. In his beak, he clutched a new treasure. It was not a fragment this time. It was a full, albeit sodden and filthy, piece of parchment. It had been rolled into a tight scroll, its edges softened and stained by water and time, but it was intact, and it was covered in writing. Elara snatched it with a trembling, desperate hand. She carefully unrolled it on the driest patch of stone she could find, using small pebbles to weight its corners. The ink was blurred in places, the script a formal, angular hand she didn't recognize, but the words she could decipher made the blood drain from her face. Ensure the shipment from the Iron Marches is misdirected. Lorien's forces will be stretched thin at the pass. The King's inspector must be, persuaded, your guarantee of the northern title upon success. The Raven Keep's old drainage culvert remains the secure drop point. It was a directive, a plan, a blueprint for treason. It wasn't the final, damning proof. It wasn't signed by Blackwood himself, but it outlined the very conspiracy that had doomed Lorien. It spoke of misdirected resources, of bribed officials, of a plan to weaken Lorien's position and set him up for a fall. This was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice from the grave, screaming the truth. The wet place Moore had discovered was the old drainage culvert mentioned in the letter, a secret, waterlogged channel used by Blackwood to communicate with his co-conspirators. Elara looked from the water-stained treason on the floor to Moore, who was preening his rain-dampened feathers with an air of profound satisfaction. They were close. So close. They had found the conspirators' message route. Now, they needed the one piece of evidence that tied it all directly to Lord Valerius Blackwood. They needed his personal seal, his own hand, on an order for murder. The game had changed. She was no longer just a prisoner seeking to survive. She was a hunter, and she had just caught the scent of her prey. The crows had given her not just a message, but a map. And at the end of that map lay Lord Blackwood's head. The water-stained parchment was a ghost that haunted Elara's every waking moment. She had committed its damning phrases to memory, repeating them like a prayer of vengeance. Lorien's forces will be stretched thin. Your guarantee of the northern title. It was the echo of the trap that had sprung shut around her husband, and now it was her key to breaking free. But a key was useless without a lock to turn. They needed the final piece. Blackwood's own hand, his personal seal, his undeniable command. The wet place, the old drainage culvert, was the source, but it was outside, far below her cell, inaccessible and likely watched. The crows could retrieve messages from it, but they couldn't discern which scrap of parchment was the one she needed. They needed a new strategy, a way to narrow the hunt. It was then that the second thread of her fragile hope began to pull taut. The guard. He was older, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and old scars. His shoulders stooped not just from the weight of his armor, but from the weight of years. He was the one who delivered her meager rations. Most did so with averted eyes, their silence a wall of complicity. But this one, whose name she had overheard was Gareth, sometimes hesitated. His eyes, a faded blue, would flicker towards her for a moment too long, and in them she thought she saw not malice, but a deep, weary shame. The day after Moore brought her the treasonous scroll, Ser Gareth arrived with her bowl. As he set it down, his knuckle, rough and calloused, deliberately tapped twice on the stone floor beside it. Tap, tap. It was not an accident. Elara's breath hitched. She remained still, a statue of grief, but her mind was racing. Was it a signal? A warning? A simple nervous tick? He straightened up, and as he did, his gaze fell upon the small, crude doll she still kept for Blackwood. He stared at it for a long, pregnant moment. Then his eyes met hers. There was no smile, no nod, but there was a flicker of something, acknowledgement. It was as if he was confirming a suspicion he'd long held. He turned to leave, but at the door he paused. Without looking back, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble barely louder than the scraping of his boots. "The ravens are loud tonight," he muttered. "The Lord Blackwood, he does not care for their noise. He finds it accusatory." Then he was gone, the bolt sliding shut with its usual finality. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was a message, a deliberate, dangerous message. Blackwood was nervous. The crow's activity had drawn his attention, and Ser Gareth was telling her. He was not just a passive observer. He was a potential ally, a crack in Blackwood's armor. She had to respond. But how? She had nothing to offer him but risk. The next time he came, she was ready. As he placed the bowl down, she spoke, her voice a dry, rasping whisper, aimed at the floor. "The crows see many things," she murmured. "They remember the old lords, the true lords." Ser Gareth froze. He did not look at her, but his hand, still on the bowl, tightened. "They nest in the old places," Elara continued, pushing her luck, her life, onto this single, fragile card. "In the whetstones, they find interesting things to line their nests with." This was the gamble. She was telling him she had found something. She was telling him she knew about the culvert. For a terrifying second, there was only silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed the bowl an inch closer to her. A tiny, almost imperceptible act of solidarity. "Be careful what they find, my lady," he whispered back, his voice so low she barely caught it. "Some secrets have sharp teeth. They bite the hand that uncovers them." He left quickly, but the air in the cell was charged. An understanding had been forged in the space of 2 whispered sentences. He knew she was hunting, and he was warning her of the danger. Elara turned to Moore, who had observed the entire exchange from the shadows of the high ceiling. "He is with us," she breathed. "Or at least, he is not with them." This changed everything. Ser Gareth could be their eyes and ears inside the keep's guard. He could warn them of Blackwood's inspections, of increased scrutiny. But more importantly, his words confirmed the existence of this sharp-toothed secret, the one that could destroy Blackwood. They were on the right path. That night, she gave Moore a new command. "Not just any parchment," she instructed, holding up the Blackwood doll and then miming the act of pressing a seal into wax. The one with his mark, the one he would not want found, the one that bites. The alliance was sealed. It was no longer just a widow and her crows. It was now a conspiracy of 3. A queen, her king of crows, and a knight with a troubled conscience. The net was closing, and the key to the lock was within reach. But as Ser Gareth had warned, some secrets bite back, and Elara could feel the sharp teeth drawing nearer with every passing hour. The alliance with Ser Gareth was a frail raft in a stormy sea, but it was enough to keep Elara from drowning in despair. His next visit came with a sliver of salted pork hidden under the bread, a king's feast in her world of deprivation, and a warning delivered through a series of coded taps on the doorframe. 2 long, 3 short. Danger. Inspection soon. Blackwood was getting nervous. The crow's heightened activity around the tower had not gone unnoticed. The lord of the keep was coming to see the source of the nuisance with his own eyes. Time, which had once stretched into a meaningless eternity, suddenly contracted into a single, urgent point. They had to find the evidence now, before Blackwood arrived and possibly had her moved, or worse, silenced permanently. The pressure forged their communication into a weapon of perfect sharpness. Elara Moore and his murder worked with a frantic, silent synergy. She had refined her charcoal map, and Moore now understood the specific target. Not just any parchment from the wet culvert, but the one bearing the unbroken, undeniable seal of House Blackwood. The crows became discerning curators, bringing her scrolls only of a certain weight and texture, ignoring the more common, flimsier scraps. Then, on the eve of the day Ser Gareth's taps had warned of, it happened. It was not Moore who delivered it, but Scout. The smaller crow burst into the cell, his flight erratic, a frantic craw-craw-craw tearing from his beak. He dropped his burden on the floor before her as if it were a burning coal. It was a scroll, thicker than the others, sealed with a large, perfect disk of blood-red wax. And impressed into that wax was the coiled serpent, its every scale rendered in exquisite, terrifying detail. The serpent was not just coiled, it was striking. This was it. The bite of the serpent. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely break the seal. She unrolled the parchment, her eyes scanning the formal, commanding script. It was a direct order, written in Valerius Blackwood's own, unmistakably sharp hand. By my command and authority as Regent of the Northern Marches, Lord Lorien Starkwood is to be apprehended for high treason against the crown. His forces are to be isolated at the Iron Pass. Allow no reinforcements. See that he does not survive to stand trial. The stability of the North depends on his silence. The blame will fall upon the mountain clans. This order is absolute. Valerius Blackwood. There it was. Not conjecture, not implication. A clear, cold command for murder. The words "see that he does not survive to stand trial" seemed to burn on the page. This was the proof that would not only clear Lorien's name, but would hang Valerius Blackwood from the very walls he now controlled. A wild, triumphant sob caught in her throat. She had it. After all the hunger, the cold, the despair, she held the truth in her hands. Lorien, my love, your name will be cleansed. But triumph was a fleeting ghost. The sound of heavy, booted footsteps echoed on the stairs outside. Not the solitary, weary tread of Ser Gareth. Multiple men, and the jangling of armor and keys. Blackwood, he was here. Now, panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She had the evidence, but she was trapped with it. If they found it on her, it would be destroyed, and she would be dead within the hour. More, she hissed, her voice strangled with fear. The great crow was already in motion. He swooped down, his intelligent eyes understanding the crisis instantly. But the scroll was too large, too heavy for him to carry. The footsteps were just outside the door. The bolt began to screech as it was drawn back. There was no time to hide it on her person. They would search her. There was no crevice in stone they would not probe. In a moment of sheer, desperate inspiration, Elara did the only thing she could. She scrambled to the far corner, to the small, foul-smelling drain hole in the floor, the one that carried away rainwater and waste. It was too small for the scroll, tearing the precious, damning parchment into 3 pieces. She rolled them into tight cylinders. As the heavy oak door began to swing inward, she shoved 2 of the pieces into the drain. They disappeared into the darkness below. The 3rd piece, the one with Blackwood's signature and the deadly command, she held out to Moore. The door flew open, framing the tall, gaunt figure of Lord Valerius Blackwood, his face a mask of cold contempt. His eyes scanned the cell, taking in the ragged woman, the charcoal drawings on the wall, the crows on the ledge. In that split second, as Blackwood's gaze swept past her, Moore darted forward. His beak snatched the final, most crucial piece of the scroll from her fingertips. With a powerful beat of his wings, he shot straight up into the shadowy rafters of the high ceiling, vanishing into the darkness. Blackwood's eyes snapped back to her, missing the exchange. He saw only a half-mad woman cowering in a corner. Well, his voice cut through the tense silence, dripping with mockery. I heard the crows had made a queen of you. You seem to have less majesty than I was led to believe. Elara said nothing. She met his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The evidence was safe. 2/3 were in the bowels of the castle, and the most important piece was with her king, in the shadows above. She had the proof. Now, she just had to survive long enough to use it. The serpent had struck, but it had failed to kill its prey. And now, the prey held its venom. Lord Valerius Blackwood stood in the center of her cell, a vulture inspecting a carcass. His cold eyes swept over the charcoal maps on the wall, the crude dolls, the scattered crow feathers. Drawing on the walls, Elara? He sneered, kicking at a small pile of bones she had saved for Moore's offerings. The madness has taken you faster than I anticipated. A fitting end for the wife of a traitor. Elara remained curled in her corner, playing the part of the broken wretch. But inside, her mind was a fortress. Her thoughts focused on the rafters, where Moore hid with his priceless treasure. She said nothing, her silence a weapon against his gloating. He circled her, his boots scraping on the stone. The crows, he mused, his voice dangerously soft. They are agitated. My men report unusual activity. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Perhaps you've been feeding them, tainting them with your treason. He stopped, his gaze piercing her. Elara kept her eyes downcast, her breathing shallow. He could suspect all he wanted. Without proof, he was just a man shouting at the wind. After a long, tense minute, he scoffed. It matters not. The king's justice will be here within a fortnight to formally seal your fate. Enjoy your court until then. With a final contemptuous glance, he turned and swept out, the door booming shut behind him, the bolt sliding home with a sound of grim finality. The moment the footsteps receded, Moore glided down from the rafters, the piece of parchment still clutched securely in his beak. Elara took it from him, her hand steady now. The crisis had passed, but a new, more perilous race had begun. A fortnight. She had 2 weeks to get this evidence to the outside world. The plan formed in her mind, a desperate, audacious scheme. She could not send the entire scroll. It was too bulky, and 2/3 of it were lost in the drain. But this piece, the piece with the kill order and Blackwood's signature, was the heart of the venom. It was enough. Her target was Lord Brendan, the aging lord of the Silver Marches. He had been Lorien's oldest friend and staunchest ally, a man of unshakable honor. His keep lay 5 days' hard ride to the east, a journey fraught with danger. For a crow, it was a formidable but not impossible flight. "We need a messenger," she whispered to Moore, smoothing the precious fragment on her knee. "The fastest, the strongest, one who can fly to Brendan." She set to work, using the last of her strength. She tore a long, wide strip from the bottom of her underskirt. It was the cleanest material she had. With the sliver of charcoal, she wrote a simple, urgent message, her script tiny and cramped. "Blackwood murdered Lorien. He comes for the north. Hold this line. Send help to Raven Keep. Elara Starkwood." She then carefully wrapped the strip of cloth around the piece of parchment, creating a tight, protective cylinder. The final, most delicate task was securing it. She had no string, no cord, but she had the crows. She had seen how they wove twigs and horsehair into their nests. "Scout," she called softly. The nimble crow hopped forward. She pointed to his nest, then mime pulling a long, thin strand. Understanding dawned in his beady eyes. He flew off and returned minutes later with several long, strong strands of dry grass and what looked like a horse's tail hair, expertly braided together. It was perfect. With painstaking care, she used the natural fiber to tie the message cylinder to Scout's left leg, making sure it was secure but not so tight as to impede his circulation. He chirped, testing the weight, hopping from foot to foot. "To Brendan," she repeated, holding the Lorien doll and pointing east, the direction Lorien had always indicated when speaking of his friend. "Find the silver banners. Find the old lord. Give this only to him." Scout looked at Moore, who gave a low, commanding guttural sound. It was an order. The smaller crow bobbed his head, let out a determined cry, and shot out the window like a black arrow, the makeshift scroll tied to his leg. Now, there was nothing to do but wait and hope. The days that followed were an agony of suspense. Every rustle of feathers made her heart leap. Every hour that passed without Scout's return felt like a lifetime. She barely ate, her stomach churning with anxiety that was worse than hunger. Had Scout been caught by a hawk? Had he gotten lost? Had he reached Brendan, only to find the old lord dead or turned? Moore was her sole comfort. He remained by her side, a silent, brooding presence. He would bring her morsels of food, which she could barely force down, and his steady gaze seemed to will her to hold on. On the 5th day, as the cold dawn broke, a familiar shape tumbled through the window. It was Scout. He was exhausted, his feathers ruffled, one tail feather missing, but he was alive, and his leg was bare. The message was delivered. He hopped towards her, chirping weakly. In his beak, he carried a new, tiny object. It was a single, dried petal from a winter rose, the sigil of House Brendan, a token, a confirmation. Elara clutched the petal to her chest, a sob of relief and vindication wrenching from her throat. She had done it. She had reached beyond the stone walls. The truth was in the hands of a friend. But as she celebrated, a new sound reached her ears from the courtyard below. The unmistakable clamor of many arriving horses, the shout of new voices, the clank of unfamiliar armor. The king's justice had arrived early. The relief curdled into ice-cold fear. The help from Brendan could not possibly arrive in time. She was still trapped, and now the official executioner was at the gate. The winged courier had succeeded, but had he been fast enough to save his queen? The final, most dangerous act was about to begin. The clamor from the courtyard was a death knell. The king's justice was here, a fortnight's hope crushed into a single, brutal morning. Elara's moment of triumph, symbolized by the tiny rose petal in her palm, turned to ash in her mouth. Brendan's help was days away. She was alone, with nothing but the truth and her winged allies, facing the cold, formal end. The door to her cell groaned open sooner than she expected. But it was not the hooded executioner or Blackwood's guards. It was Ser Gareth. His face was grim, etched with a resolve she had not seen before. "It is time, my lady," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Blackwood means to present you to the king's justice as a madwoman. Your ravings about crows and conspiracies used to seal your fate and erase Lord Lorien's memory forever. You must come." For a fleeting moment, she feared he was leading her to the block. But the look in his eyes, a mix of fear and fierce determination, told her otherwise. This was not a summons to death, but to a trial. Her trial. "The proof," she whispered, rising on unsteady legs. "The proof is your word, and the testimony of the keep itself," he replied, offering a steadying arm she did not take. She would walk into that room on her own strength, or not at all. As Ser Gareth led her down the winding stairs, a dark shadow followed, flitting silently from rafter to rafter above them. More. The great hall of Raven Keep was a cavern of cold stone and colder faces. At the high table sat Lord Valerius Blackwood, a smirk of triumph playing on his thin lips. Beside him sat a man in the rich, somber robes of the king's justice, his expression one of bored impartiality. The hall was lined with Blackwood's men, their hands on their sword hilts. "Lord Justice," Blackwood began, his voice echoing in the hall, "I present Elara Starkwood, widow of the traitor Lorien. As you can see, her confinement has unhinged her. She speaks to the birds, you see, fancies them her servants." The king's justice looked at Elara, his gaze dismissive. "The law is clear. The wife shares the fate of the traitor, unless proven otherwise. Do you have anything to say before the sentence is confirmed?" All eyes turned to her. She was a skeleton in rags, standing before the powers of the realm. But as she lifted her chin, her eyes blazing with a fire that had been forged in hunger and despair, she did not look like a madwoman. She looked like a queen. "I do." Elara's voice, though raspy, did not tremble. It carried, clear and sharp, to every corner of the hall. "I am not mad, my lord. I am a witness, and I have brought another." She raised a hand and pointed to the shadowy rafters. "The true lord of this keep has come to give his testimony." A wave of uneasy laughter rippled through Blackwood's men, but it died in their throats as a great, dark shape detached itself from the shadows. Moore landed on the back of an empty oaken chair, directly between Elara and the high table. He was immense, his feathers glistening like polished jet, his eyes holding the ancient knowledge of the stone around them. He dropped a single, blood-red wax seal, the one he had pried from the scroll, onto the wooden chair back. The coiled serpent stared up at Blackwood. The lord's smirk vanished. "This is the madness I spoke of," he snarled, rising to his feet. "Seize that creature. Seize her. The crows do not serve me, Lord Blackwood," Elara declared, her voice growing stronger. "They serve the memory of Lady Starkwood. They serve the truth. They have been your messengers, have they not? Using the old drainage culvert to carry your treasonous orders. They brought your secrets to me." Blackwood's face went pale. "Lies." At that moment, a thunderous sound erupted from the courtyard. The sound of dozens of hooves, shouted challenges, and the distinctive ring of northern steel. The main doors to the great hall burst open. A rider, covered in the dust of a hard journey, stood panting in the doorway. Behind him, through the open doors, Elara could see banners, the silver winter rose of House Brendon, and the mailed fist of another northern lord. Scout's message had not just been received. It had ignited a fire. The rider strode into the hall, ignoring everyone but the king's justice. He dropped to one knee. "My lord justice, I am Captain Edric of House Brendon. We intercepted a royal courier bearing your summons and came with all haste. Lord Brendon sends this and his full support." He held out a sealed letter, but before the justice could take it, Moore let out a piercing, commanding shriek that silenced the entire hall. Then, from every window, every archway, the murder descended. Dozens of crows flooded into the great hall, a swirling, cawing tempest of black wings. They did not attack. They settled on banners, on sconces, on the shoulders of stunned guards, turning the hall into a living, breathing court of black-feathered judges. In the stunned silence, Elara spoke her final, damning words, pointing a finger at Blackwood. "You left me in a tower to starve, but the ravens had other plans. They were your couriers, and now they are your accusers. The proof of your treason is not just in a letter. It is in their memory. It is in this keep. Ask them where you hid your orders. They will show you." The king's justice looked from the panicked Blackwood to the unwavering Elara, to the sea of silent, watching crows. The supernatural truth of it was undeniable. The evidence was no longer just parchment. It was the very atmosphere. "Lord Valerius Blackwood," the justice said, his voice cold and formal, "you are remanded to custody on suspicion of high treason. The testimony of the keep will be heard." As Blackwood shouted and was seized by his own now hesitant guards, Elara did not move. Moore flew from his perch and landed on her outstretched arm, his weight a familiar, comforting anchor. The widow of the Raven Keep stood amidst the swirling crows and the assembled lords, no longer a prisoner, no longer a victim. She was the proof. She was the memory. She was the queen who had been crowned not by gold, but by feather and claw, and her reign of truth had just begun. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comment section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you gave our video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the card section at the top right. See you in the next video.